King Charles recently experienced a health scare that was so genuinely severe it forced Princess Anne to actually start talking, and that is honestly the detail that should make every single person paying attention sit up straight. If you know absolutely anything about the Princess Royal, you know that she simply does not do this. She does not give heartfelt interviews about private family matters. She does not release emotional personal statements, and she absolutely never uses the global media as a tool to leverage sympathy the way some other members of her family have mastered. Her entire existence in the public eye has been built on one unbreakable titanium-clad principle. You show up, you do the work, and you never ever talk about what happens behind closed palace doors. That level of discretion isn't just her personality. It is the entire foundation of her public brand. So when word started leaking out through the tightest circles in London that she had spoken openly and ominously about the king's actual condition, the reaction among veteran royal watchers wasn't just surprise. It was pure, unadulterated alarm. People who study this family understand exactly what it means when Anne shatters her own golden rule. It does not happen casually, it does not happen accidentally, and it definitively does not happen unless the situation behind the velvet ropes has reached a catastrophic point where staying quiet has become vastly more dangerous than speaking up. To really grasp the magnitude of this fracture in royal protocol, you have to look at how Princess Anne has operated for her entire life. This is a woman who has stood like a stone pillar beside the monarchy through decades of relentless, devastating crises. She was there through the absolute turmoil of the 1990s when the institution felt like it was actively tearing itself apart from the inside out. She navigated the years of ruthless tabloid pressure. She watched the tragic fallout of high-profile royal divorces. And she stood firm when her mother's health inevitably declined with a sudden finality that shook the entire United Kingdom. Through all of those earth-shattering events, Anne remained a fortress of silence. She does not reach for dramatic language, and she does not seek the spotlight. Therefore, when she finally decides to open her mouth and break rank, she is sending a distress signal. She isn't doing it to grab a headline. She is doing it because the highly manicured narrative the palace is feeding the public has become entirely disconnected from the dark reality she is witnessing firsthand. But the way she chose to deliver this warning was what truly sent shockwaves through the establishment. The setting for this unprecedented breach wasn't a formal press conference, and she didn't call a group of journalists together to read from a carefully vetted piece of paper. What actually happened was infinitely more telling. She was at a completely routine, unglamorous public engagement, the exact type of duty she has executed flawlessly thousands of times over the last 50 years. But instead of offering the usual polite pleasantries and moving along, she made remarks that went entirely off script. Multiple people in that room heard her, and within hours, those specific words were being quietly relayed to senior royal correspondents who instantly realized the gravity of what had just occurred, and acknowledged the king's situation with a blunt directness that caught everyone completely off guard. She didn't dress it up in the comfortable, fluffy language of optimism that Buckingham Palace's communications machine had been aggressively pushing for months. Instead, she stated in terms that left zero room for interpretation that the family was navigating an extremely difficult period. She pointed out that the physical and emotional demands on everyone surrounding the king had intensified considerably, and she warned that the road ahead was absolutely not going to be straightforward. And those words were just the beginning of the revelation. You have to read those specific phrases through the lens of royal code because, on the surface, they might just sound like measured diplomacy. But placed against the backdrop of an institution that lies by omission for a living, those words were explosive. When a senior, blood royal uses the phrase extremely difficult period regarding the sovereign's physical state, they are using the most severe language legally available to them. Every single syllable and speaks is curated. So when she drops a phrase like that, she is deliberately piercing the veil. But she went even further, moving the conversation from mildly concerning to genuinely terrifying. She spoke about the dizzying speed at which circumstances had shifted around the king in just a matter of weeks. According to one highly placed source, she used a phrase that literally stopped the room in its tracks. She stated that the royal family had been reminded in the most brutal, direct way possible that absolutely nothing about this situation could be taken for granted. Coming from a woman who has survived assassination attempts and witnessed the rise and fall of global empires, that is not a poetic reflection on mortality. That is a highly precise, calculated warning to the public that the situation is incredibly fragile. And the immediate aftermath of that warning completely shattered the palace's carefully constructed illusion. In the hours and days after Anne's off-the-cuff remarks filtered into the insider circles, the atmosphere in London shifted into a state of intense, frantic activity. Veteran royal correspondents began making highly encrypted calls. Deep-cover sources who had previously been fiercely guarded suddenly became willing to share terrifying fragments of the truth. And the picture that rapidly emerged from the shadows was considerably darker and more unstable than anything the official press secretaries had been willing to put on the public record. The king's recent health episode had not been a neatly contained incident with a clean, predictable resolution. It was severe enough to trigger an emergency review of his entire operational schedule for the foreseeable future. It was serious enough that highly classified conversations had secretly begun regarding contingency planning at the absolute highest levels of the British government. The people closest to Charles were no longer speaking about his recovery in the confident, breezy terms they had used throughout the early parts of 2024. That sudden, chilling shift in language among the inner circle was its own kind of screaming alarm bell. But to fully understand why the palace panicked over this leak, you have to look at the massive deception they had been running for months. When King Charles's severe diagnosis was first announced to the world, it was widely praised as a rare, refreshing moment of transparency from a family notoriously obsessed with secrecy. The palace deployed its words with absolute precision. They flooded the media with talk of cutting-edge treatments, boundless optimism, and the king's ironclad determination to continue serving his people. For a fleeting moment, that framing actually held together. Charles eventually returned to a few public duties. He was photographed looking relatively well, and the recovery narrative was being managed with surgical precision. But managing a PR narrative and controlling biological reality are two entirely different beasts. By the time 2025 rolled around, the massive, gaping canyon between the optimistic press releases and the king's actual physical capability had widened in ways that were becoming impossible to hide. Reports started bubbling up from terrified sources deep within the royal household that the king had experienced a sudden, deeply alarming episode that required immediate, highly specialized medical intervention. And the palace's response to this? Complete, deafening silence. There was no press briefing, no carefully worded update, nothing. And in the royal world, silence is never empty. It is usually full of panic. But the cover-up was about to cause an even bigger crisis. Anyone who has studied the modern British monarchy knows that when the palace goes radio silent, it generates infinitely more damaging questions than any official statement ever could. Suddenly, high-profile engagements were being shifted or cancelled without any logical explanation. Aides were giving nervous, vague assurances to their press contacts. Senior courtiers, the men in gray suits who normally control the flow of information, became entirely unreachable. The story began to mutate and spread the way stories always do when the establishment tries to forcibly suppress them, through encrypted whisper networks and off-the-record conversations with medical personnel who couldn't stay entirely quiet. The fragments of truth pointing to this shadow emergency revealed that the inner circle had been pushed into a state of absolute, quiet terror. The king's public visibility wasn't just slightly adjusted. It was stripped back to the bone in a way that went vastly beyond routine medical management. The institution was actively utilizing a very old, very practiced playbook. They did this with King George VI in the 1950s, and they did it during the final, fading months of the late Queen's life. The strategy is simple. Reduce the schedule, frame every absence as temporary, keep the tone relentlessly optimistic, and say absolutely nothing for as long as humanly possible. But this time, the grand strategy was spectacularly failing. And it was failing because the weight of the crown was suddenly crushing the one man who wasn't quite ready to carry it. As the king's capacity quietly diminished behind the ancient walls of Buckingham Palace, an unbearable amount of pressure was violently transferred directly onto the shoulders of Prince William. The Prince of Wales was forced to step up into the void, a shift that was immediately visible to anyone watching the royal calendar. He began taking on heavier, more constitutionally significant engagements, appearing in high-stakes contexts that would previously have been strictly reserved for the reigning sovereign. He was carrying the public-facing weight of the monarchy with a grim deliberateness that suggested he fully understood the terrifying gravity of his new reality. But William stepping up is not just a neutral, helpful act of a dutiful son. Inside the viper's nest of royal politics, it is a massive, disruptive statement about succession. It represents a rapid, unplanned shifting of gravity from one generation to the very next. And this acceleration, driven entirely by medical necessity rather than careful institutional design, created toxic frictions that nobody had prepared for. The lines of authority inside the palace became dangerously blurred. Decisions that normally required the king's direct, personal authorization were suddenly being handled at a remove, leaving courtiers scrambling to figure out who was actually giving the orders. William found himself trapped in the ultimate nightmare, trying to act as a shadow king while simultaneously trying to be a supportive son to a man who wasn't ready to let go of the reins. And this impossible dynamic exposed the fatal flaw in King Charles's ultimate master plan. For decades before he took the throne, Charles championed a very specific, highly publicized vision for the future of the institution: the slimmed-down monarchy. He wanted a tighter, more efficient royal firm with fewer working members carrying a more focused set of responsibilities. It sounded great in boardroom presentations, and in the early days of his reign, he aggressively put that vision into practice. But a slimmed-down monarchy has one massive, glaring vulnerability. It depends entirely on the tiny handful of people at the center remaining perfectly healthy, completely scandal-free, and fully functional at all times. And that is exactly where the grand design spectacularly imploded. First came the king's shocking diagnosis. Then came the devastating news regarding the Princess of Wales, removing her from the board for a significant period of recovery. Add to that the permanent exile of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex and the forced removal of Prince Andrew in disgrace, and suddenly, the slimmed-down monarchy looked exactly like a skeleton crew. The immense, crushing weight of a global institution that used to be distributed across a dozen sets of shoulders was now concentrated almost entirely on Prince William and Princess Anne. The bench was completely empty. There were no reserves to call up. The structural integrity of the royal firm was buckling under the strain, and Princess Anne, observing this slow-motion collapse from the inside, realized that pretending everything was fine was no longer an option, which leads to the ultimate, unspoken fear echoing through the palace corridors. There is a specific, terrifying question that absolutely nobody inside the royal establishment wants to say out loud. The courtiers won't whisper it, the PR teams aggressively avoid it, and the family themselves refuse to entertain it. But King Charles's severe health scare has dragged this question into the center of the room, and it cannot be ignored any longer. What exactly happens to the British monarchy if the king can never fully return to his absolute capacity? We are not talking about the A word. Abdication is a deeply toxic concept in Britain. The trauma of 1936 left a scar on the institution that took a century to fade, and Charles has spent his entire existence preparing for this singular destiny. He is not going to voluntarily walk away. But there is a massive, dangerous gray area between a formal abdication and being a fully functional, highly visible sovereign. A monarch who is permanently hidden from view, who delegates all heavy lifting to his heir, and who ceases to be the active, engaging focal point of the nation is functionally diminished. And a slow, mismanaged diminishment can actually do vastly more long-term damage to the credibility of the crown than a clean, sudden rupture. The public can handle tragedy, and they can handle transition, but they will not tolerate being lied to by an institution that demands their loyalty and their tax dollars. Princess Anne recognized this highly toxic dynamic forming. Her unprecedented decision to speak out was not a moment of weakness. It was a desperate, calculated attempt to inject a dose of hard reality into a conversation that was drifting dangerously into the realm of pure fiction. The British monarchy is currently standing on the edge of a remarkably precarious cliff. The strategy of managed, forced optimism has completely run its course, and the gap between the sunny press releases and the grim reality has become a massive liability. Princess Anne did what nobody else in the family had the courage to do. She shattered the glass and told the truth. Now, the institution faces a defining historical test. They can either embrace the uncomfortable honesty that Anne introduced, treating the public with the respect they deserve as the crown navigates this dark chapter. Or they can retreat back behind the velvet ropes, double down on the spin, and risk losing the trust of the nation forever. The road ahead is not straightforward, and the old playbook has officially burned to the ground. The only question left is whether the royal family realizes it before it's too late.